I never thought that at 58 years old, I'd find myself standing in the parking lot of Mama Rosa's Italian restaurant, watching through the window as my own family celebrated without me. The warm golden light spilling from inside illuminated their faces as they laughed and raised their wine glasses in a toast, completely unaware that I was out here in the October evening chill, clutching my car keys with trembling hands. Just 3 hours earlier, my son Michael had called to tell me their anniversary dinner was canceled due to a work emergency. Now here they were, my son, his wife Jessica, my daughter Rachel and her family, all gathered around a table laden with breadsticks and pasta, acting as if nothing had happened. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't canceled dinner, they had canceled me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The day had started like any other Thursday in Maplewood, Colorado. The aspen trees outside our Victorian home on Cedar Street were just beginning to turn their brilliant shades of gold, creating a carpet of color that never failed to make me smile during my morning coffee ritual. I had been particularly excited because tonight was supposed to be special. Michael and Jessica's 5th wedding anniversary dinner at Mama Rosa's, the cozy Italian place where David and I had celebrated our own milestones for years. They had invited the whole family, and I had spent the better part of the week planning what to wear, even buying a new burgundy blouse that I thought would photograph well for the inevitable family picture. David had left early for his insurance office downtown, mumbling something about a difficult client meeting as he grabbed his travel mug and kissed my cheek absently. After 32 years of marriage, these morning routines had become as predictable as the sunrise. But lately, something felt different. He seemed more distant, more preoccupied, though whenever I asked about it, he would brush off my concerns with a tired smile and change the subject. I told myself it was just work stress. The insurance business had been challenging lately with all the wildfire claims in Colorado, but deep down, a small voice whispered that something more fundamental was shifting between us. My morning at the Maplewood Public Library, where I worked part-time cataloging new acquisitions, passed pleasantly enough. I had started working there 3 years ago, partly for the extra income, but mostly because I needed something that was mine, after Rachel and Michael had both settled into their adult lives. The quiet atmosphere and the smell of books provided a sanctuary where I could lose myself in organizing information and helping patrons find exactly what they were looking for. Miss Henderson, the head librarian, often commented on how natural I was with people, how I seemed to instinctively know what someone needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. Around noon, I received a text from Jessica asking if I could help her pick up a special cake she had ordered for tonight's dinner. She was swamped at her marketing job and worried she wouldn't make it to the bakery before they closed. Of course, I immediately agreed, feeling that familiar warmth that came from being needed by my family. I spent my lunch break driving across town to Sweet Dreams Bakery, where I collected a beautiful 3-layer chocolate cake, decorated with elegant sugar flowers and Happy 5th Anniversary written in gold script across the top. The young woman behind the counter, probably around Jessica's age, chatted with me as she carefully boxed the cake. "This is gorgeous," she said admiringly. "Anniversary dinner must be pretty special. Are you the mother of the bride or groom?" When I explained that I was Michael's mother, her face lit up. "Oh, how wonderful that the whole family gets together for celebrations like this. That's getting rarer these days." Her comment filled me with pride. We were one of those close families that people admired, the kind that still prioritized spending time together despite busy schedules and demanding careers. I spent the afternoon at home, preparing for the evening ahead. I took a long bath, carefully applied makeup that highlighted my brown eyes without looking overdone, and slipped into the new burgundy blouse paired with my best black slacks and the pearl necklace David had given me for our 20th anniversary. Standing in front of our bedroom mirror, I felt satisfied with my appearance, elegant but not trying too hard, appropriate for a mother celebrating her son's milestone. At 4:30, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I answered cheerfully, expecting him to confirm the dinner time or ask me to pick up something else for the celebration. Instead, his voice sounded strained and apologetic. "Mom, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to cancel tonight. Jessica just got pulled into this emergency project at work, and it's going to run really late. We're thinking of postponing the whole dinner until next weekend when things calm down. The disappointment was sharp and immediate. I had been looking forward to this evening all week, had already mentally prepared myself for the joy of watching my son and daughter-in-law celebrate their love surrounded by family. But these things happened. Work emergencies, last-minute changes, the unpredictable nature of modern life. Of course, sweetheart, I heard myself saying, these things can't be helped. Should I hold on to the cake, or do you want me to drop it off at your house? There was a pause before Michael answered. Actually, could you just keep it for now? We'll figure out what to do with it later. Something in his tone struck me as odd, but I attributed it to stress and disappointment. After all, he was probably just as frustrated about the change in plans as I was. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of our bed, still dressed for an evening that would no longer happen. The burgundy blouse that had seemed so perfect an hour ago now felt foolish, overdressed for a quiet night at home. I considered calling Rachel to see if she wanted to grab dinner together instead. She lived 30 minutes away in Pine Valley, but she might be free, but decided against it. She had her own family obligations, and I didn't want to seem like I was desperately scrambling for company just because one plan had fallen through. David came home around 6, earlier than usual, which surprised me since his difficult client meeting had supposedly required extra time. When he saw me still dressed up, his expression grew confused. Are you going somewhere? He asked, loosening his tie as he headed toward the kitchen. The anniversary dinner got canceled, I explained, following him. Work emergency on Jessica's end. Michael called a few hours ago. I waited for David to express disappointment or suggest an alternative plan for our evening, but he simply nodded and opened the refrigerator, studying its contents as if it contained the secrets of the universe. That's too bad, he said finally, pulling out leftover Chinese takeout from 2 nights ago. Guess it's just us tonight then. There was something in his tone that made me pause, not disappointment exactly, but almost relief, as if he had been dreading the family gathering rather than looking forward to it. We ate dinner in relative silence, David scrolling through his phone between bites while I picked at my lo mein and tried to shake the strange mood that had settled over me. When he excused himself to catch up on some work emails immediately after dinner, leaving me alone with the dishes and the remainder of our quiet evening, I felt a familiar loneliness creeping in. This had been happening more often lately, David retreating to his home office after dinner, our conversations becoming increasingly surface level, a growing sense that we were 2 people sharing a house rather than a married couple sharing a life. By 8 o'clock, restlessness had overtaken me completely. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and the evening stretched ahead with nothing but television reruns and early bedtime to fill it. On impulse, I decided to drive to the grocery store. We needed milk anyway, and getting out of the house might help shake this melancholy mood that had settled over me like a gray cloud. The drive through downtown Maplewood was peaceful in the early autumn evening. The historic district was bustling with its usual Thursday night activity, couples walking hand in hand to restaurants, groups of friends heading into the local brewery, teenagers hanging out near the old fountain that had been the town's centerpiece for over a century. As I passed the block where Mama Rosa's was located, I glanced over automatically, remembering the canceled anniversary dinner and feeling another pang of disappointment. That's when I saw them. Through the large front window of Mama Rosa's, clearly visible under the warm pendant lights that gave the restaurant its cozy ambiance, sat my entire family. Michael and Jessica were at the head of a table for 8, Michael wearing the navy blazer I had helped him pick out last month and Jessica radiant in a red dress I had never seen before. Across from them sat Rachel and Tom, with little Sophie and Lucas on booster seats beside them. Even David's sister Margaret was there, along with her husband Paul, completing the gathering that was supposed to have been canceled due to a work emergency. I pulled over immediately, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel and stared through the restaurant window at a scene that made no sense. They were laughing, clearly enjoying themselves, wine glasses filled and appetizers scattered across the table. Jessica was opening what appeared to be anniversary gifts, while Michael beamed beside her, his arm draped casually across the back of her chair. Rachel was helping Lucas cut his food while Tom and Margaret engaged in animated conversation. It was exactly the warm family celebration I had imagined we would all be enjoying together, except for one glaring detail. I wasn't there. The beautiful 3-layer anniversary cake I had picked up from Sweet Dreams Bakery was nowhere to be seen, which meant they had either gotten a different cake or decided to skip dessert entirely. But the absence of the cake was the least of my concerns, as the full reality of what I was witnessing crashed over me like a cold wave. This dinner hadn't been cancelled. The emergency at Jessica's work didn't exist. My son had lied to me, deliberately excluded me from a family celebration, and right now, none of them seemed to miss my absence in the slightest. I sat in my car for what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, watching my family enjoy their evening together while trying to process what this meant. Had I done something wrong? Said something offensive that I couldn't remember? Were they angry with me about something? And this was their way of expressing it, or worse, and this thought made my stomach clench with a nauseating realization, was my presence at family gatherings now seen as unnecessary, burdensome, something to be avoided rather than welcome. As I watched, I saw Margaret lean over to whisper something in Jessica's ear, causing both women to burst into laughter. Rachel was taking photos with her phone, capturing moments that would become family memories I wouldn't be part of. David's sister, who lived 2 hours away and rarely made the trip to Maplewood for anything other than major holidays, had apparently been worth including when I was not. The exclusion felt intentional, calculated, and completely mystifying. Finally, I couldn't bear to watch anymore. I started my car and drove home through streets that suddenly felt foreign, as if I was seeing my own neighborhood through different eyes. The Victorian house on Cedar Street, that had been our family home for over 20 years, looked exactly the same as it had when I left for the grocery store, but everything else had changed irrevocably. I was no longer a valued member of my own family's inner circle. I was someone they could discard without a second thought, someone whose absence from important moments didn't even register as a loss. Inside the house, David's home office door was closed, and I could hear the faint sound of his voice through the wood. He was on a phone call, speaking in low tones that didn't carry enough for me to make out words, but the rhythm suggested a personal conversation rather than a work-related one. Under normal circumstances, I might have knocked to let him know I was back from the store, but nothing about this evening felt normal anymore. Instead, I went upstairs to our bedroom, where I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing my burgundy blouse and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The photo albums on our dresser suddenly seemed to mock me with their documentation of family togetherness. Pictures from holidays, birthdays, graduations, and anniversaries spanning decades showed a family that appeared close and loving. But how many of those smiles had been forced? How many of those gatherings had I attended only because excluding me would have seemed too obvious, too cruel? The woman in those photographs looked happy, surrounded by people she loved and believed loved her in return. Now I wondered if that woman had been naive, blind to signs that everyone else could see clearly. When David finally came upstairs around 10:30, I was still sitting in the same position, still wearing my dinner outfit like armor against a battle I hadn't known I was fighting. He looked surprised to see me still dressed up, as if he had forgotten about the canceled dinner entirely. "You okay?" he asked, but there was something distracted about the question, as if his mind was elsewhere. "You seem upset about something." For a moment, I considered telling him what I had witnessed at Mama Rosa. I imagined his shock, his immediate indignation on my behalf, his assurance that there had to be some mistake or misunderstanding, but something held me back, perhaps the memory of his relieved tone when I told him dinner was canceled, or the way he had retreated to his office immediately after our quiet meal together, or the realization that he hadn't once suggested we make alternate plans for the evening, despite knowing how much I had been looking forward to the celebration. Instead, I simply said, "Just tired." "It's been a long day." He nodded and headed into the bathroom to brush his teeth, apparently satisfied with my non-explanation. As I listened to his familiar nighttime routine, through the closed door, I realized that this moment was a test of sorts. Would he notice that something was genuinely wrong? Would he press me for details or offer comfort even though I claimed to be fine? Would the man who had supposedly known me better than anyone else for over 3 decades recognized that his wife was experiencing something more than ordinary fatigue. When he emerged from the bathroom and climbed into bed beside me, offering nothing more than a distracted good night before turning away to face his side of the room, I had my answer. David was no more attuned to my emotional state than our children were to my desire to be included in their lives. I was surrounded by people who claimed to love me but apparently didn't know me well enough to notice when I was falling apart. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept soundly beside me, his breathing deep and regular. Outside our bedroom window, the aspens rustled in the October wind, their golden leaves occasionally tapping against the glass like fingers seeking entry. I thought about the patterns I had been blind to for years, the way family plans were often made without consulting me, the assumption that I would always be available when needed, but could be easily excluded when convenient. The gradual shift from being an integral part of my children's lives to being more like a helpful neighbor they occasionally called upon for favors. The anniversary cake sat downstairs in our refrigerator, a 3-layer monument to my own irrelevance. Tomorrow Jessica would probably call to ask if I could drop it off at their house, and I would probably agree with the same cheerful accommodation I always showed when my family needed something from me. But tonight, lying in the darkness of a marriage that felt increasingly hollow and a family role that apparently meant less than I had ever imagined, I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped being so accommodating. What would happen if Linda Martinez finally started prioritizing Linda Martinez? The thought was both terrifying and oddly liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that falling might actually feel like flying. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the golden aspen leaves shimmer like coins scattered across our front yard. I woke before my alarm, having slept fitfully through a night filled with fragments of dreams, where I was always searching for a door that everyone else seemed to know how to find. David was already gone, his side of the bed cold to the touch, which meant he had left even earlier than usual. A note on the kitchen counter informed me he had an early client breakfast, and would be out most of the day dealing with a complex claim investigation. I made my coffee in the quiet kitchen, the familiar ritual feeling hollow as I stood by the window watching the neighborhood come to life. Mrs. Chun, next door, was walking her ancient golden retriever, the same route they had taken every morning for the past 8 years. The Johnsons across the street were loading their twin boys into their minivan for school, the usual chaos of backpacks and lunch boxes playing out on their front step. Everything appeared exactly as it should be, yet I felt like I was watching it all from behind glass, separated from the normalcy I had always taken for granted. The phone rang as I was getting dressed for work, and Jessica's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the answer button as I wondered what excuse she would offer for last night. When I finally answered, her voice was bright and cheerful, completely devoid of any guilt or awkwardness. "Good morning, Linda. I hope you had a nice quiet evening last night. I felt so terrible about having to cancel dinner at the last minute." Her tone was so perfectly sincere that I almost questioned what I had seen with my own eyes. Almost. "It was fine," I managed, keeping my voice neutral. "These things happen. You're so understanding," she continued. "Actually, I was wondering if I could ask another favor. Michael surprised me with this gorgeous anniversary necklace last night, when we ended up just having a quiet dinner at home, and I realized I never picked up the cake from the bakery. Could you possibly drop it off here sometime today? I know it's an imposition, but with work being so crazy right now," the lie came so easily to her, so smoothly crafted, that I wondered how long she had been practicing this particular form of deception. A quiet dinner at home. The phrase echoed in my mind as I remembered the scene at Mama Rosa's, the wine glasses and appetizers, the presence of my entire extended family celebrating together while I sat at home eating leftover Chinese food. Of course, I heard myself saying, the words automatic after decades of being the accommodating mother-in-law, "I can bring it by after work. You're a lifesaver. Oh, and Linda, maybe don't mention the cake mix-up to Mike. You know how he worries about details, and I don't want him feeling bad about the whole scheduling disaster." The request to keep secrets from my own son struck me as particularly audacious, but I agreed because that's what I always do. I agreed, and accommodated, and smoothed over inconveniences for everyone else, apparently including covering up my own exclusion from family events. Work at the library provided little distraction from the thoughts churning in my mind. I found myself mechanically processing returned books while replaying every interaction I'd had with my family over the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been other gatherings I wasn't invited to? Other lies told with such casual confidence that I had never thought to question them. Mrs. Henderson noticed my distraction during our midday staff meeting. "Linda, you seem a bit under the weather today. Everything all right at home?" Her genuine concern almost brought tears to my eyes. The simple act of someone noticing my emotional state feeling like a rare gift. "Just tired," I replied, the same non-answer I had given David the night before. But unlike my husband, Mrs. Henderson didn't accept the dismissal so easily. "You know, dear, sometimes when we're feeling unsettled, it helps to try something completely new. Have you ever considered taking one of those evening classes at the Community Arts Center? I keep meaning to sign up for their pottery workshop myself." The suggestion planted a seed that I filed away for later consideration. When was the last time I had done something purely for myself, something that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's dreams or maintaining someone else's comfort? I couldn't remember, which seemed like an answer in itself. The drive to Michael and Jessica's house in the Willowbrook subdivision took me through the historic district, past Mama Rosa's, with its cheerful red awning and window boxes filled with autumn musk. I deliberately slowed down as I passed, half expecting to see some evidence of last night's celebration, though I wasn't sure what that might be. The restaurant looked exactly as it always did, giving no hint that it had been the scene of my family's carefully orchestrated exclusion just 12 hours earlier. Michael and Jessica's ranch-style home sat on a corner lot with an immaculate front yard that Jessica maintained with the same meticulous attention she brought to her marketing campaign. Their HOA had strict guidelines about landscaping, and every house in the subdivision looked like it had been designed by the same committee dedicated to inoffensive perfection. As I pulled into their driveway, I noticed a delivery truck from Petal Perfect Florist just pulling away, and through their front window I could see an enormous arrangement of red roses on their dining room table. Jessica answered the door wearing yoga clothes and a radiant smile, looking refreshed and happy in a way that suggested she had slept much better than I had. "Linda, thank you so much for bringing the cake. You're seriously the best mother-in-law ever." The compliment felt like salt in a wound, particularly since the best mother-in-law ever hadn't been considered worthy of inclusion in the actual anniversary celebration. I handed over the cake box and was about to leave when Michael appeared behind Jessica, still in his work clothes despite it being nearly 5 o'clock. "Mom, what brings you by?" His surprise seemed genuine, as if the idea of me stopping by his house was unusual rather than routine. When Jessica explained about the cake, his expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read: embarrassment, guilt, or simply annoyance that I was lingering when he had expected a quick handoff. "Well, since you're here," Jessica said, though her tone suggested this wasn't particularly welcome news, "would you like to come in for a few minutes?" I was just about to start dinner prep. The invitation felt obligatory, the kind offered when refusing would seem too rude, but acceptance wasn't genuinely desired. In the past I would have declined graciously, sensitive to their need for privacy as a young married couple. But something about the past 24 hours had shifted my perspective, and I found myself accepting. Their living room showcased Jessica's impeccable taste in home decor, all neutral colors and carefully curated accessories that looked like they belonged in a design magazine. The roses I had glimpsed from outside dominated the dining room table, at least 3 dozen stems arranged in a crystal vase that caught the late afternoon light streaming through their picture window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Those are beautiful," I commented, nodding toward the flowers. "Aren't they gorgeous?" Jessica practically glowed as she touched one of the petals. "Michael surprised me with them this morning. He said he felt terrible about our anniversary being so low-key yesterday because of my work situation." The casual lie, delivered with such convincing sincerity, made my breath catch in my throat. I looked at Michael expecting to see some sign of discomfort or guilt, but he was scrolling through his phone with the distracted air of someone whose attention was already elsewhere. "That was thoughtful of him," I managed, wondering how many layers of deception I was expected to navigate in this simple conversation. Jessica launched into a detailed description of her work crisis, spinning an elaborate tale about a client presentation that had gone disastrously wrong and required immediate damage control. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed the story until it felt true, adding specific details about conference calls and revised proposals that made the fiction feel substantial and believable. Michael occasionally nodded or added supporting comments, the two of them collaborating in this performance with practiced ease. As I listened to them construct their alternative reality, I began to understand that this wasn't a spontaneous deception born of guilt or thoughtlessness. This was a deliberate choice to exclude me from their celebration, planned carefully enough that they had backup explanations ready for any questions that might arise. The realization was more devastating than the original exclusion, because it suggested a level of premeditation that transformed a thoughtless slight into something approaching cruelty. When Michael's phone rang and he stepped away to answer it, Jessica and I were left alone in their picture-perfect living room, with its carefully maintained facade of domestic happiness. She busied herself adjusting the roses, but I sensed an underlying nervousness that hadn't been there when Michael was present to help maintain their shared story. "How was your quiet evening at home?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "Did you end up cooking something special for the anniversary?" Her hands stilled on the flower stems for just a moment before she resumed her arranging. "Oh, you know how it is when you're exhausted from work. We just ordered pizza and watched a movie, very low-key, but sometimes those are the best kinds of celebrations, pizza and a movie." I wondered if she had forgotten about claiming they had a quiet dinner at home when she called this morning, or if she simply assumed I wouldn't notice the inconsistency. The casual way she layered lie upon lie suggested this wasn't her first experience with creative storytelling, and I began to wonder what other family narratives might be more fiction than fact. Michael returned from his phone call looking pleased about something, his earlier distraction replaced by an energy that seemed at odds with the subdued anniversary celebration Jessica had been describing. "That was Tom," he announced. "He wanted to thank us again for last night, said the kids had such a great time, and Rachel was thrilled that we finally got to do a proper family dinner at Mama Rosa's." The words hung in the air like a confession, and I watched Jessica's face drain of color as she realized what Michael had just revealed. His own expression shifted from pleased to horrified as he processed what he had said, and for a moment, all three of us stood frozen in a tableau of exposed deception. "I mean," Michael started, then stopped, clearly realizing there was no way to unsay what had already been said. "It's fine," I said quietly, though we all knew it wasn't. I already knew. The admission seemed to surprise them more than if I had erupted in anger or tears. Jessica sank into one of their pristine armchairs as if her legs could no longer support her, while Michael stared at me with an expression of dawning comprehension that suggested he was finally seeing me as something other than the perpetually understanding mother he had always taken for granted. "How?" he asked simply. I drove past the restaurant on my way to the grocery store, saw the whole family through the window having a wonderful time. I kept my voice steady, though inside I felt like I was dissolving. Even Margaret and Paul were there. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he had inherited from his father and displayed whenever he was deeply uncomfortable. "Mom, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. The dinner was Jessica's idea, and she thought it would be better if it was just the younger generation this time. You know, a different kind of celebration." "Whose idea was it to lie to me about it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer from the way Jessica was studying her hands with intense concentration. "We didn't want to hurt your feelings," Jessica said finally, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "We thought it would be easier if you just didn't know." The explanation was so much worse than if they had simply said they wanted time alone or needed space from family obligation. It revealed a fundamental understanding of who I was and what I valued, as if they believed I was so fragile and needy that I couldn't handle being excluded from one family dinner. More than that, it showed they thought so little of my intelligence that they assumed I would never discover their deception. "Easier for whom?" I asked. Neither of them had an immediate answer to that question, and in their silence, I began to understand something that had been hiding just beneath the surface of our family dynamics for years. I had become the person who was managed rather than consulted, handled rather than included. They discussed what to tell me rather than whether to invite me, viewing my feelings as something to be carefully controlled rather than honestly engaged with. "I should go," I said, standing up from their expensive sofa that had never quite felt comfortable anyway. "Thank you for clarifying things, Mom. Please don't leave like this," Michael said, following me toward the door. "Can't we talk about this, work something out?" I paused with my hand on their front door handle, considering his request. For a moment I imagined the conversation we might have, their apologies, my reassurances, the gradual return to our previous dynamic, where such incidents were smoothed over and never discussed again. The familiar pattern of accommodation and avoidance that had characterized our relationship for years. "What would you like to work out, exactly?" I asked, turning to face him. "The fact that you lied to me, or the fact that you excluded me in the first place?" "Both," he said quickly. "Neither." "I don't know, Mom. I just don't want you to be upset." The answer revealed everything I needed to know about how my son viewed our relationship. He didn't want me to be upset, but he also didn't want to change the behaviors that had upset me. He wanted the comfort of my forgiveness without the discomfort of examining why forgiveness was necessary. "I am upset," I said simply. "And maybe that's not something you need to fix or manage. Maybe it's just something you need to accept." I left them standing in their doorway, their perfectly coordinated home, providing a backdrop for their shared confusion about why their carefully managed mother was suddenly refusing to be managed. As I drove away from their subdivision with its uniform lawns and matching mailboxes, I felt something shifting inside me, like tectonic plates finally moving after years of building pressure. The drive home took me past the community arts center, where a sign in the window advertised evening pottery classes starting the following week. Without allowing myself to overthink the decision, I pulled into the parking lot and walked inside to register. The young woman at the reception desk was enthusiastic and welcoming, asking no questions about my experience level or motivations, simply handing me a registration form and explaining the class schedule. "It's very therapeutic," she said, as I filled out the paperwork. "A lot of our students say it helps them work through things when life gets complicated." I paid the registration fee with my own credit card, not the joint account I shared with David, and walked back to my car with a receipt for something that was entirely mine. The pottery class represented my first independent decision in longer than I could remember, a small act of self-determination that felt disproportionately significant. At home, David's car was still absent from our driveway, and the house felt even emptier than it had that morning. I heated up leftover soup for dinner and ate it standing at the kitchen counter while reading through the pottery class materials, trying to imagine myself covered in clay and focused on creating something beautiful rather than maintaining something that was slowly breaking apart. When David finally came home around 9 o'clock, I was already in my pajamas, sitting in our living room, with a cup of tea and a book I had been meaning to read for months. He looked surprised to find me downstairs, as if he had expected me to be already asleep or at least safely contained in our bedroom, where my presence wouldn't require any particular attention from him. "How was your day?" he asked, settling into his recliner with the weary sigh of someone who had been dealing with demanding people and complicated problems for hours. "Interesting," I replied, closing my book and looking at him directly. "I found out that Michael and Jessica didn't actually cancel their anniversary dinner last night. They just didn't want me there." David's expression shifted from tired disinterest to alert concern, though I noticed he didn't seem particularly surprised by the revelation. "What do you mean they didn't want you there?" I explained about driving past Mama Rosa's and seeing the family celebration, about the lies Jessica had told that morning, about Michael's accidental confession that afternoon. David listened without interruption, his face growing more troubled as the story unfolded. "That's terrible," he said when I finished. "Michael should have been honest with you from the beginning instead of making up stories about work emergency." His response focused on the deception rather than the exclusion, as if the real problem was that they had lied about not wanting me there rather than not wanting me there in the first place. The distinction felt important, though I wasn't sure David understood why. "Were you planning to attend this dinner?" I asked him. "Before it got cancelled, I mean." He hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer before he spoke. "Jessica mentioned something about it a few weeks ago, but I told her I probably couldn't make it because of work. You know how busy things have been lately." The response felt rehearsed too convenient, and I wondered if David had been given his own version of the truth about last night's celebration. Had he known about the exclusion and said nothing, or had he been fed a different story entirely? Either possibility suggested a level of family coordination that deliberately circumvented me, treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be included. "I signed up for a pottery class," I announced, changing the subject before the conversation could drift into the comfortable territory of shared indignation about our children's poor choices. "It starts next week," David nodded absently, already reaching for the television remote. "That sounds nice, honey. You've always been creative." The dismissive response might have satisfied me a week ago, but tonight it felt like another small rejection in a day full of larger ones. David wasn't curious about why I had chosen pottery, or when the classes met, or what had motivated me to try something completely new. He simply filed the information away as another minor detail about his wife's activities that didn't require his attention or interest. As he settled into his evening routine of channel surfing and occasional commentary about news stories or sports scores, I realized that my marriage had become as much about careful management as my relationship with my children. David and I existed in parallel tracks, sharing space and responsibilities but rarely engaging in meaningful connection. He told me about his work problems in general terms that required nothing from me but sympathetic listening, and I told him about family logistics and household concerns that affected his comfort but demanded no emotional investment. When was the last time we had talked about dreams or fears or hopes for the future? When had we last laughed together over something genuinely funny rather than politely amusing? When had either of us last felt truly seen and understood by the other person, rather than simply accommodated and managed? The questions felt too large and complicated for a Thursday evening in October, so I kissed David goodnight and went upstairs to bed, leaving him alone with his television programs and his comfortable distance from anything requiring too much thought or feeling. But as I lay in the darkness listening to the aspen leaves tap against our bedroom window, I couldn't shake the sense that today had marked the beginning of something important, though I wasn't yet sure if it was an ending or a beginning. The pottery class receipt sat on my nightstand like a small declaration of independence, and for the first time in years I fell asleep excited about something that belonged entirely to me. The pottery studio smelled of earth and possibility, a rich clay scent mixed with the metallic tang of glazes, and the faint chemical odor of kiln fire. Wednesday evening had arrived with an unexpected snowfall that dusted Maplewood's streets in early winter white, making the warm interior of the Community Arts Center feel like a refuge from more than just the cold weather. I stood in the doorway of Studio B watching 8 other people arrange themselves around wheeled tables laden with mysterious tools and lumps of gray clay that looked utterly unpromising. Helen Rodriguez noticed my hesitation and waved me over to an empty station beside her. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and paint-stained fingers that suggested this wasn't her first creative endeavor. "First time?" she asked with a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, hanging my jacket on the back of my chair and staring dubiously at the wheel in front of me. "Honey, we all started somewhere. I've been coming here for 3 years and I still make more ashtrays than actual pottery." Her laugh was infectious and I found myself relaxing for the first time in days. The instructor, a woman named Sarah who looked young enough to be my daughter, gathered us around her demonstration wheel with an enthusiasm that made clay work seem like the most exciting activity in the world. "Tonight we're going to learn centering," she announced, her hands already moving confidently as she positioned a lump of clay on the spinning wheel. "It's the foundation of everything else we'll do, and it's also the most challenging part for beginners." As she worked, her hands steady and sure as the clay transformed from an awkward lump into a perfectly symmetrical mound, she talked about the importance of pressure and patience, of finding the balance between control and surrender. "The clay will tell you what it wants to do," she explained, but you have to listen with your hands, not your head. When it was my turn to try, the clay seemed determined to do everything except what I wanted. It wobbled and lurched, spinning off-center despite my increasingly frustrated attempts to guide it into submission. My hands, accustomed to gentle tasks like turning book pages and arranging flowers, felt clumsy and inadequate against the clay's stubborn resistance. "Don't fight it so hard," Helen suggested from beside me, where her own clay was behaving only marginally better. "I used to squeeze the life out of everything when I first started. My instructor told me I was trying to control the clay instead of partnering with it." The advice resonated in ways that had nothing to do with pottery. How much of my life had I spent trying to control outcomes instead of working with the natural flow of circumstance? How often had I squeezed relationships and situations until they became rigid and lifeless in my desperate attempt to make them conform to my expectations? By the end of the 2-hour class, I had managed to center my clay exactly once, for about 30 seconds, before it lurched sideways and collapsed into an abstract sculpture that bore no resemblance to anything useful. But in those 30 seconds, I had felt something magical happen. The clay had become responsive under my hands, spinning smoothly and rising slightly as if it wanted to become something beautiful. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced before, a perfect moment of harmony between intention and material reality. "You felt it, didn't you?" Sarah asked, appearing beside my wheel as I stared at the remnants of my brief success. "That moment when everything clicked," I nodded, unable to articulate the profound satisfaction of those few seconds when the clay and I had been partners instead of adversaries. "That's what we're chasing," she said with a knowing smile. "It gets easier to find that feeling, but it never gets old." Walking to my car through the light snow, I felt energized in a way I hadn't experienced in months. My hands were stained with clay despite repeated washings, and my clothes smelled of earth and creativity. For 2 hours I had been completely present in my body and focused on something that demanded my full attention. There had been no room for worry about family dynamics or marriage troubles. No space for the constant mental narrative about what everyone else needed from me. Helen caught up with me in the parking lot, fishing her car keys out of a purse that looked like it had survived several art projects. "You want to grab coffee somewhere? There's a place called Mountain Brew that stays open late, and they make a decent chai latte." The invitation surprised me. When was the last time someone had asked me to do something purely social, without any underlying agenda or family obligation? "I'd like that," I heard myself saying, though part of me worried about getting home too late and having to explain my whereabouts to David. Mountain Brew Cafe occupied a converted Victorian house near downtown, with mismatched furniture and local artwork covering every available wall space. The atmosphere was casual and welcoming, filled with college students working on laptops and groups of friends, deep in animated conversation. Helen and I found a quiet corner table where we could talk without competing with the general buzz of caffeine-fueled energy. "So what brought you to pottery?" Helen asked after we had settled in with our drinks. "Midlife crisis, divorce, empty nest syndrome?" Her directness might have seemed intrusive from someone else, but her tone was so warmly curious that it felt like genuine interest rather than prying. "Family crisis, I suppose," I replied, surprised by my own honesty. "I discovered recently that I'm not as important to my children as I thought I was." Pottery seemed like a good way to focus on something that's just mine. Helen nodded with the understanding of someone who had navigated similar territory. "Been there. When my youngest finally moved out 5 years ago, I realized I had no idea who I was without kids to raise and meals to plan around everyone else's schedule. Took me about 6 months of feeling sorry for myself before I decided to try new things instead of mourning the old ones." "What did you try?" "Everything I could afford and fit into my schedule. Pottery, photography, ballroom dancing, book clubs, hiking groups. Some of them stuck, some didn't. But all of them taught me something about myself that I'd forgotten or never known in the first place." The idea of experimenting with multiple activities felt both exciting and overwhelming. "Did your husband support all this exploration?" Helen's expression grew more complex. "Ex-husband. Turns out that when I started developing my own interests and opinions, He decided he preferred the old version who built her life around his preferences. The divorce was finalized last year. The casual way she mentioned such a significant life change caught me off guard. Helen looked happy and settled, not like someone still recovering from a failed marriage. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. "Don't be." "Best thing that ever happened to me, though I couldn't see it at the time." Amazing how much energy you have for your own life when you stop spending it all maintaining someone else's comfort. She sipped her chai thoughtfully. "What about your husband? Is he supportive of your new ventures?" I considered the question carefully. David hadn't objected to the pottery class, but he also hadn't shown any interest in it beyond the most perfunctory acknowledgement. "He's neutral, not opposed, but not particularly engaged either." "Neutral can be harder than opposition sometimes," Helen observed. "At least when someone fights you, they're paying attention. Indifference is its own kind of loneliness." Her words articulated something I had been feeling but couldn't name. David's lack of curiosity about my inner life felt more dismissive than if he had actively disapproved of my choices. At least disapproval would have suggested he saw me as someone whose decisions mattered enough to have opinions about. We talked for another hour, covering everything from parenting challenges to career regrets to the peculiar freedom that came with middle age. Helen had retired early from teaching high school English, using her pension and savings to fund what she called her experimental decade. She was learning Spanish, planning a solo trip to Spain the following summer, and considering whether to sell her large family home for something smaller and more manageable. "The thing about being our age," she said as we prepared to leave, "is that we finally have permission to be selfish. Not cruel or inconsiderate, but genuinely focused on what makes us happy instead of what makes everyone else comfortable." Driving home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, I thought about Helen's words and the evening I had just experienced. For the first time in years, I had spent time with someone who was genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences, not because of what I could do for them, but simply because they enjoyed my company. The conversation had been reciprocal, with both of us sharing and listening in equal measure. At home, David was exactly where I had expected to find him, settled in his recliner with the television remote and a glass of wine that suggested he had been there for some time. He looked up when I entered, taking in my clay-stained clothes and wind-tousled hair with mild curiosity. "How was the pottery thing?" he asked, his attention already drifting back to the screen where a basketball game was providing the evening's entertainment. "Good," I replied, then decided to push beyond the usual shorthand of our conversations. "I met a really interesting woman named Helen. She's a retired teacher who's been taking art classes for several years. We went for coffee afterward and had a great conversation about travel and learning new skills." David nodded absently. "That's nice, honey. Sounds like you're making friends." The response felt dismissive, reducing my evening to a social activity suitable for a child rather than recognizing it as evidence of my expanding world and developing interest. I waited for him to ask follow-up questions about Helen or the pottery class itself, but his eyes had already returned to the game, and I realized no further inquiry was coming. "I'm thinking about signing up for a photography workshop next month," I said, testing whether a future plan might generate more engagement than a past experience. "Mm-hmm," he replied, his attention clearly divided between my words and whatever play was developing on screen. "Whatever makes you happy." The phrase "whatever makes you happy" had become David's standard response to any activity that didn't directly affect him, and I was beginning to understand it as a polite way of expressing indifference, rather than support. He wasn't invested enough in my happiness to explore what actually made me happy. He simply wanted to avoid any disruption to his own routine. The next morning brought a phone call from Rachel that interrupted my peaceful breakfast routine. Her voice was tight with the particular stress that came from managing work deadlines while coordinating family logistics. "Mom, I need a huge favor," she began without preamble. "Sophie's school is having their fall festival this Saturday, and I promised I'd help with the bake sale booth. But Tom's mother just went into the hospital with chest pains, and we need to drive to Denver to be with her. Could you possibly cover the bake sale for me? It's just 3 hours on Saturday afternoon, and all the donations are already organized." The request was reasonable and the kind of family emergency that naturally called for grandparental support. In the past, I would have immediately agreed and spent the following days organizing my schedule around the commitment. But something about the way Rachel presented it as a foregone conclusion that I would be available and willing gave me pause. "When did you find out about Tom's mother?" I asked. "Last night around 10. We got the call from the hospital and decided to drive up first thing Saturday morning. I know it's short notice, but you're always so good about stepping in when we need help. Always so good about stepping in." The phrase highlighted a pattern I was only now beginning to recognize. My family's default assumption was that I would be available for any emergency or inconvenience, that my own plans were flexible enough to accommodate their sudden need. When was the last time anyone had asked about my schedule before requesting a favor, or acknowledged that saying yes might require me to sacrifice something I valued? "I can't do Saturday," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "I have plans." The silence that followed suggested Rachel was as surprised by my response as I was. "Oh, well, what kind of plans? Maybe you could reschedule." The automatic assumption that my plans would be less important than hers triggered something defensive in me. "I'm going to a pottery workshop in Boulder. It's been scheduled for weeks." This was only partially true. I had seen the workshop advertised and been considering it, but hadn't actually registered yet. However, the lie felt justified by Rachel's assumption that whatever I might be doing could easily be rearranged to suit her convenience. "A pottery workshop," Rachel repeated, as if the words didn't quite make sense together. "Mom, this is Sophie's school festival. It's a family commitment." "It's your commitment," I corrected gently. "You volunteered for the bake sale booth, and now you're unable to fulfill that obligation because of a legitimate family emergency. But that doesn't automatically make it my responsibility." The conversation that followed was uncomfortable in ways that family conversations rarely were for us. Rachel alternated between guilt-inducing reminders of how much Sophie was looking forward to having Grandma Linda at her school festival, and increasingly frustrated suggestions that I was being unreasonably inflexible. She seemed genuinely confused by my unwillingness to rearrange my schedule for what she clearly saw as a reasonable request. "I don't understand why you're being like this," she said finally, her voice taking on the wounded tone she had perfected as a teenager. "Since when do you choose pottery over family?" "Since I realized that family seemed to work just fine without me when it was convenient," I replied, thinking of the anniversary dinner at Mama Rosa. "Michael and Jessica managed to have a lovely celebration last week without any grandmother input. I'm sure Sophie's school festival will be equally successful without my bake sale assist." The reference to Michael's anniversary dinner clearly caught Rachel off guard, though I realized she must have known about my exclusion from that event since she had been one of the celebrants. "That was different," she said weakly. "That was more of a couple's thing." "With children present," I pointed out, "and Margaret and Paul. It was a family thing that I wasn't considered family enough to attend." Rachel's silence suggested she was processing the implications of what I was saying, perhaps for the first time considering how the anniversary dinner exclusion might have affected me. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller and less demanding. "Mom, I didn't know you were upset about that. Michael said Jessica thought it would be better to keep it small." "I'm not upset," I said, though this wasn't entirely true. I'm learning about where I actually fit in this family's priorities, and I'm adjusting my availability accordingly." The conversation ended with Rachel saying she would figure something else out for the bake sale, though her tone suggested she felt I was being unreasonably difficult rather than appropriately self-protective. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee growing cold, processing the strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction that came from setting a boundary with one of my children. The guilt was familiar, the same feeling I experienced whenever I disappointed someone or failed to meet their expectations, but the satisfaction was new, a sense of having honored my own needs instead of automatically sacrificing them for someone else's convenience. Even though I hadn't actually registered for the Boulder Pottery Workshop yet, the fact that I could have done so felt important. My time belonged to me first, and I could choose to share it rather than having it assumed and appropriate. By afternoon, the guilt had faded enough for me to actually register for the Boulder workshop, making my morning lie retroactively truthful. The workshop focused on advanced centering techniques, and promised individual attention from a master potter who had studied in Japan. The registration fee was more than I would normally spend on myself without consulting David, but I paid it from my personal checking account with a sense of claiming territory that was rightfully mine. When David came home that evening, I mentioned both Rachel's request and my refusal, curious to see how he would respond to my uncharacteristic assertiveness. "You told Rachel no?" he asked, and I couldn't tell if his tone reflected surprise or disapproval. "That doesn't sound like you." "Maybe it's time I became more like me and less like what everyone expects me to be," I replied. David considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "I suppose if you'd rather do pottery than help with your granddaughter's school festival, that's your choice." The response stung because it missed the point entirely. This wasn't about preferring pottery to Sophie's festival. It was about refusing to be the automatic solution to everyone else's scheduling conflict. It was about recognizing that my time and energy had value even when they weren't being used in service of family obligations. "It's not about pottery versus Sophie," I said carefully. "It's about Rachel assuming I would drop everything to solve her problem without even asking if I was available." "Isn't that what family does?" David asked. "Help each other out when emergencies come up." His question highlighted the fundamental disconnect in how we viewed family relationships. In David's understanding, family help flowed primarily in one direction, from the older generation to the younger, from those with fewer obligations to those with more pressing demands. The idea that help should be reciprocal or that requests should be made with consideration for the helper's existing commitments seemed foreign to him. "Family should ask for help, not assume it," I replied. "And family should consider whether their emergencies automatically become everyone else's obligations." David's expression suggested he found this distinction unnecessarily complicated. In his world, family was about meeting needs and solving problems, not navigating the delicate negotiations of mutual respect and consideration. The conversation ended with him retreating to his home office to catch up on work emails, leaving me alone with the growing realization that my marriage operated on the same assumptions as my relationships with my children. That weekend, while Rachel scrambled to find alternative coverage for the bake sale booth, and probably complained to anyone who would listen about her unreasonable mother, I spent Saturday in Boulder learning advanced pottery techniques from a soft-spoken man, whose hands moved over clay like a pianist playing a familiar concerto. The workshop was challenging and meditative, requiring complete focus and offering the deep satisfaction of gradual improvement. During lunch break, I struck up a conversation with another student, a woman named Maria who had driven down from Fort Collins for the workshop. She was recently divorced, and using pottery as what she called moving meditation to help process the major life changes she was navigating. "There's something about working with clay that puts everything else in perspective," she said as we ate our sandwiches in the studio's small courtyard. "All those voices in your head telling you what you should be doing or feeling just go quiet when you're trying to center a piece on the wheel." I knew exactly what she meant. The past few weeks had been filled with internal dialogue about family expectations and personal boundaries, but during the intensive focus required for pottery work, those concerns faded into background noise. The clay demanded presence and attention, leaving no mental space for worry or regret. "My daughter thinks I'm having some kind of midlife crisis," I confided. "She can't understand why I'd choose pottery over helping with my granddaughter's school festival." Maria laughed, but not unkindly. "My kids went through the same phase when I started doing things for myself instead of organizing my life around their needs. They kept waiting for me to come to my senses and go back to being the self-sacrificing mother they were used to. When I didn't, they eventually adjusted their expectations." "How long did that take?" "About a year of me consistently prioritizing my own growth over their convenience. It was uncomfortable for everyone, but now our relationships are actually healthier because they're based on choice rather than obligation." The idea that relationships could be healthier when based on choice rather than obligation felt revolutionary. All my life I had assumed that good mothers and wives put everyone else's needs first, that love was measured by willingness to sacrifice personal desires for family harmony. But what if that approach actually weakened relationships by making them one-sided and unsustainable? Driving home from Boulder through the mountain curves with afternoon light filtering through golden aspen groves, I felt something shifting in my understanding of myself and my relationship. The pottery workshop had been exactly as challenging and rewarding as I had hoped, but more importantly, it had been mine. No one else's needs or expectations had shaped the experience, and the satisfaction I felt was purely personal rather than reflected through someone else's appreciation. For the first time in decades, I had spent an entire day doing exactly what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it without apology or justification. The freedom was intoxicating and slightly terrifying, like discovering a new room in a house I thought I knew completely. I had no idea what other possibilities might be waiting behind doors I had never thought to open, but I was finally ready to find out. November brought an early frost that turned Maplewood's remaining autumn colors into crystalline sculptures, each leaf edged with silver and sparkling in the morning light. I stood at my kitchen window watching this transformation while sipping coffee from a mug I had thrown and glazed myself during the past month of pottery classes. The ceramic was imperfect, slightly lopsided with a glaze that had pooled unevenly in spots, but it was entirely mine in a way that nothing else in this house seemed to be anymore. The changes in my daily routine had been gradual but accumulated. 3 pottery classes per week, photography walks through downtown Maplewood with a camera Helen had helped me choose, Spanish conversation meetings at the library led by a retired professor who made learning feel like an adventure rather than work. Each new commitment carved out space in my schedule that belonged to me alone, creating a structure that didn't revolve around David's needs or my children's emergencies. David had begun to notice these changes, though his observations came wrapped in the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he wasn't sure whether to be concerned or relieved. "You're certainly keeping busy these days," he had commented the previous evening when I returned from a photography exhibition opening at the Community Arts Center. The statement hung between observation and question, inviting me to explain myself without actually asking for an explanation. "I'm discovering interests I never had time to explore before," I had replied, which was true but incomplete. What I was really discovering was a version of myself that existed independently of other people's needs and expectations. A Linda Martinez who had opinions about art and politics and travel that weren't filtered through family harmony or social acceptability. This morning's coffee ritual was interrupted by the familiar sound of my phone buzzing against the kitchen counter. Michael's name appeared on the screen and I hesitated before answering. Our conversations since the anniversary dinner revelation had been stilted and careful, both of us navigating around the exposed foundation of our relationship without quite knowing how to repair it. "Good morning, Michael," I said, deliberately keeping my tone warm but neutral. "Hi, Mom. How are you doing?" His voice carried that particular quality of forced casualness that meant he was calling with a purpose beyond simple check-in. "I'm well. Just enjoying my coffee and watching the frost patterns on the trees. It's really quite beautiful this morning." "That's nice," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly interested in weather observations. "Listen, Mom, I was hoping we could talk about Thanksgiving. Jessica and I have been planning the menu and we wanted to coordinate with you about what everyone's bringing." The assumption embedded in his statement caught my attention immediately, not whether I would be attending Thanksgiving at their house, but what I would be contributing to a celebration they were organizing without my input. In previous years I had been the one to plan and host Thanksgiving dinner, spending weeks preparing menus and coordinating schedules to ensure everyone could attend. When had that responsibility shifted to Michael and Jessica, and why hadn't anyone thought to discuss it with me? "I wasn't aware you were hosting Thanksgiving this year," I said carefully. "When was that decided?" There was a pause that suggested Michael was realizing he had skipped several steps in the conversation. "Well, Jessica and I thought it might be nice to take over hosting duty. Give you a break from all that cooking and preparation. We figured you'd be relieved not to have to worry about it this year." The explanation had the same patronizing quality as Rachel's assumption that I would automatically cover her bake sale responsibility. My family had collectively decided what would be best for me without bothering to ask what I actually wanted. The fact that they framed it as doing me a favor made the presumption even more irritating. "That's thoughtful of you to consider my workload," I replied, "but I enjoy hosting Thanksgiving. It's one of my favorite traditions." "Oh," Michael sounded genuinely surprised, as if the possibility that I might have preferences about holiday arrangements had never occurred to him. We just thought with everything that's been going on lately, you might want something simpler this year. Everything that's been going on lately. The phrase was a careful euphemism for my recent assertion of independence, my refusal to automatically accommodate everyone else's needs. In Michael's understanding, my new boundaries were a temporary aberration that required family accommodation until I returned to my previous role as the perpetually available mother and grandmother. What exactly has been going on lately? I asked, curious to hear how he would characterize the changes in our family dynamics. Another pause, longer this time. You know, the pottery classes and photography and saying no to helping Rachel with Sophie's school thing. You seem to be going through some kind of phase where you're prioritizing yourself over family obligations. The way he said prioritizing yourself made it sound like a character flaw, something selfish and temporary that would eventually be corrected by maturity or therapy. The complete absence of self-reflection in his assessment was almost impressive in its obliviousness. I'm prioritizing myself alongside family obligations, I corrected. For the first time in 30-something years, I'm treating my own needs as equally important as everyone else. If that seems dramatic to you, it might say more about our previous dynamic than about my current choices. Mom, I don't think you're being fair. We've always been a close family who helps each other out. Help should flow in multiple directions. Mike, when was the last time you helped me with something I needed, rather than something you needed me to do for you? The question hung in the air between us, and I could almost hear him mentally reviewing our recent interactions, searching for evidence of reciprocal support that we both knew didn't exist. Our relationship had been built on my availability to solve his problems and celebrate his achievements, not on mutual care and consideration. I guess I never thought about it that way, he admitted finally, his voice smaller than it had been at the beginning of our conversation. I know you didn't. That's part of the problem. I softened my tone slightly, recognizing that Michael was struggling to understand a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamics. I love you and I want to spend Thanksgiving with you and Jessica and the rest of the family, but I'd like to be consulted about plans rather than informed about decisions that have already been made. So, you want to host Thanksgiving yourself this year? I want us to discuss it like adults who respect each other's opinions and preferences. Maybe I host. Maybe you host. Maybe we do something completely different. But whatever we decide, it should be a decision we make together. The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary, both of us learning to navigate a more equitable dynamic than either of us was accustomed to. We agreed to have a family meeting the following Sunday to discuss Thanksgiving plans, with everyone's input included in the decision-making process. It was a small step, but it felt significant in its acknowledgement that my voice deserved equal weight in family discussions. After hanging up, I found myself energized rather than drained by the difficult conversation. Standing up for my preferences had become easier with practice, and the satisfaction of being heard and respected was beginning to outweigh the discomfort of conflict. I was learning that healthy relationships required occasional friction, that avoiding disagreement often meant avoiding authentic connection. The rest of the morning was devoted to preparing for my newest venture, a solo photography trip to the abandoned mining town of Silver Creek, about an hour's drive into the mountains. Helen had recommended the location as particularly striking in late autumn, when the contrast between rusted mining equipment and golden aspen groves created compelling visual juxtapositions. I had been planning this excursion for weeks, checking weather reports and researching the area's history to add context to the images I hoped to capture. David emerged from his home office as I was loading camera equipment into my car, his expression mildly curious about the obvious preparation for an outing. "Going somewhere special?" he asked, though his tone suggested polite interest rather than genuine curiosity. "Silver Creek, it's an old mining town that's supposed to be spectacular for photography this time of year. I'm hoping to capture some images for the portfolio I'm building." Portfolio? This seemed to catch his attention more than the trip itself. "Are you planning to do something professional with photography?" The question revealed how little David understood about my new interests and activity. I had been taking photography seriously for over a month, reading books about composition and light, practicing with different techniques, even considering entering a local contest. Yet somehow this was the first time he had realized my hobby might have larger aspirations attached to it. "I'm exploring possibilities," I said, which was honest without being specific. The truth was, I didn't know exactly where my photography interest might lead, but I was enjoying the process of discovery too much to limit it with premature definition. "Well, drive carefully in the mountains," David said, already turning back toward the house. "Call if you run into any problems." The interaction felt emblematic of our marriage's current state. David was neither supportive nor disapproving of my activities, simply disconnected from them. He offered practical concern about my safety while showing no curiosity about my creative development or personal growth. It was like being married to a polite roommate who wished me well but wasn't particularly invested in my happiness or fulfillment. The drive to Silver Creek took me through winding mountain roads, lined with aspen groves in their final burst of autumn glory. The photography expedition had been Helen's suggestion, but I had embraced it as an opportunity to practice the kind of solitary adventure I had never allowed myself before. David's casual acceptance of my solo travel plans had surprised me initially until I realized it probably reflected relief that I was entertaining myself rather than expecting him to participate in activities that didn't interest him. Silver Creek turned out to be everything Helen had promised and more. The abandoned mining structures created dramatic silhouettes against the Colorado sky, while patches of snow on distant peaks provided contrast to the warm tones of fallen leaves carpeting the ghost town's empty street. I spent 3 hours wandering through the ruins with my camera, completely absorbed in the creative process of finding beauty in decay and abandonment. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Here in this place where ambitious dreams had once flourished before being left behind, I was discovering my own capacity for renewal and reinvention. The mining equipment rusted and forgotten represented one kind of ending, but the persistent beauty of the natural world reclaiming these human artifacts suggested that endings could also be beginnings. When my phone rang around noon, I almost didn't answer it, reluctant to break the peaceful concentration of my photography work. But Jessica's name on the screen triggered my maternal instincts, and I found myself accepting the call despite my inclination to ignore it. "Linda, thank God you answered." Jessica's voice was tight with stress. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I need help and I don't know who else to call." The automatic assumption that I would be available and willing to drop everything for whatever crisis had arisen felt familiar but no longer acceptable. "What's wrong, Jessica?" "I'm stuck at the emergency vet with Rusty. He got into something toxic this morning, and they're saying he needs to stay overnight for observation, but I have this huge presentation at work tomorrow that I absolutely cannot miss. Michael's in Denver for a client meeting, and won't be back until late tonight. Could you possibly pick up Rusty tomorrow afternoon, and keep him at your house until Michael gets home? I know it's a huge imposition, but I'm desperate." The request was reasonable on its surface. Rusty was Michael and Jessica's golden retriever, a sweet-natured dog I had always enjoyed spending time with. In previous circumstances, I would have immediately agreed to help, glad to be useful during a family emergency. But something about Jessica's assumption that I would automatically rearrange my schedule to solve her problem triggered the same resistance I had felt with Rachel's bake sale request. "I'm sorry, Jessica, but I can't help with Rusty tomorrow," I said, surprising myself with how easily the refusal came. "I have commitments that I can't reschedule." The silence that followed suggested Jessica was as shocked by my response as I was. "Commitments? What kind of commitment?" The question implied that any commitments I might have would naturally be less important than her emergency, that my schedule existed primarily to provide backup support for my family's unexpected needs. The casual dismissal of my time and priorities was breathtaking in its thoughtlessness. "Personal commitments that matter to me," I replied, not feeling obligated to provide detailed explanations for my unavailability. "Linda, this is an emergency. Rusty could be really sick, and I can't afford to miss this presentation. It's not like I'm asking you to babysit so Michael and I can go to a movie." The emotional manipulation was subtle but clear. By framing her request as a response to genuine crisis rather than poor planning, Jessica was trying to make my refusal seem heartless and unreasonable. But I had learned enough about boundaries over the past few weeks to recognize the tactic for what it was. "I understand it's an emergency for you," I said gently, but your emergency doesn't automatically become my responsibility. There are commercial pet care services, or you could ask one of your friends to help, or you could reschedule your presentation if Rusty's health is truly your top priority. I can't believe you're being like this. Jessica's voice rose with frustration. What's happened to you lately? You used to be so helpful and understanding. There it was again, the complaint about my failure to maintain my previous role as the family's automatic solution to inconvenient problems. Jessica missed the version of me who said yes to everything without consideration for my own needs or preferences. She wanted the perpetually available mother-in-law back, the one who existed primarily to make everyone else's life easier. I'm still helpful and understanding, I replied calmly. I'm just not automatically available for every family crisis anymore. There's a difference. The conversation ended with Jessica promising to figure something else out in a tone that suggested she felt I was being unreasonably difficult. After hanging up, I sat in my car overlooking the ruins of Silver Creek, processing the strange mixture of guilt and empowerment that came with setting boundaries during a genuine emergency. The old Linda would have immediately packed up her photography equipment and driven back to Maplewood to accommodate Jessica's needs. She would have spent the rest of the day caring for a sick dog while feeling virtuous about her willingness to sacrifice personal plans for family obligations. But the new Linda recognized that constantly rescuing my family members from the consequences of their poor planning or bad luck wasn't actually helping them develop resilience and problem-solving skills. When I finally returned home in the late afternoon, carrying a camera full of images that documented both the beautiful decay of Silver Creek and my own expanding sense of creative possibility, David was already settled in his recliner with his evening wine and news program. He looked up when I entered, his expression mildly curious about my day. How was your photography expedition? He asked, which represented more interest than he had shown in my activities for weeks. Wonderful. Silver Creek is absolutely stunning this time of year, and I got some shots that I'm really excited about developing. I paused, wondering if I should mention Jessica's call and my refusal to help with their dog emergency. Jessica called while I was up there. Rusty got into something toxic and needed emergency vet care. David's expression shifted to concern. Is he going to be okay? The vet thinks so. They're keeping him overnight for observation. I hesitated, then decided to be completely honest about the conversation. Jessica asked me to pick him up tomorrow and keep him at our house, but I told her I couldn't do it. You said no? David's surprise was evident. Why? What else do you have going on tomorrow? The assumption that my commitments would naturally be less important than Jessica's emergency was disappointingly familiar, even coming from my own husband. David's immediate question wasn't whether I had valid reasons for being unavailable, but what could possibly be more important than helping our family during a crisis. I have a portfolio review scheduled with a professional photographer who's been mentoring me, I explained, though I felt frustrated by the need to justify my choices. It's been planned for weeks, and it's important for my development as a photographer. David nodded slowly, processing this information. I suppose they found someone else to handle the dog situation. I assume so. Jessica said she would figure something out. Good, David said, his attention already drifting back to the television. I'm sure everything will work out fine. His casual acceptance of my refusal to help surprised me almost as much as my own willingness to say no had. In previous years, David would have expected me to drop my personal plans to accommodate family emergencies, viewing such sacrifice as natural and appropriate for a good wife and mother. His lack of pressure or criticism suggested either that he was beginning to respect my independence, or that he was simply relieved not to have our evening disrupted by dog-sitting responsibility. That night, as I uploaded and reviewed the photographs from Silver Creek, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with family approval or social expectation. The images captured not just the visual beauty of the abandoned mining town, but something essential about the process of finding value in forgotten places and overlooked possibility. Each photograph represented a moment when I had been completely present in my own experience, creating something meaningful that belonged entirely to me. The portfolio review scheduled for the following day represented another step in this journey of self-discovery. Margaret Chen, a professional photographer Helen had connected me with, had agreed to look at my work and provide feedback about my technical skills and creative development. The opportunity felt significant not just for the potential artistic guidance, but as recognition that my photography had progressed beyond casual hobby into something worthy of professional assessment. When I finally went to bed that night, David was already asleep, turned away from me toward his side of the room in the position that had become his default over the past few months. I lay in the darkness listening to his steady breathing while thinking about the changes that had accumulated in my life like snow building up on mountain peaks. Each individual choice to prioritize my own growth had seemed small and manageable, but together they were creating an avalanche of transformation that was reshaping not just my daily routine, but my fundamental understanding of who I was and what I deserved from life. The photography equipment arranged on my dresser caught the moonlight filtering through our bedroom window, the camera and lenses representing tools for seeing the world differently rather than simply recording it as it appeared on the surface. Tomorrow's portfolio review would help me understand how far I had come in developing this new way of seeing. But tonight I was content to rest in the knowledge that I was finally becoming someone worth photographing, someone whose perspective had value independent of her usefulness to others. Outside our bedroom window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, each flake unique and temporary but part of a larger pattern that would transform the landscape by morning. Like my own changes, the snow seemed gentle and unassuming as it fell, but its cumulative effect would be dramatic and impossible to ignore. By spring, everything would look different, and the woman who emerged from this winter of self-discovery would barely resemble the one who had started the journey standing in a restaurant parking lot, invisible to her own family and forgotten by the people who claimed to love her most. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in the kind of pristine silence that only fresh snow could create. Through the windows of Michael and Jessica's house, warm light spilled onto their front yard where my grandchildren were building a snowman that leaned slightly to the left but radiated the kind of imperfect joy that made my heart sing. I stood on their front porch holding a bottle of wine and a pottery serving bowl I had made myself, feeling simultaneously nervous and excited about this family gathering. The past month had brought unexpected changes to our family dynamics. Changes that began with the Thanksgiving planning meeting that had turned into something resembling actual family democracy. We had ended up hosting the holiday together, each household contributing dishes they genuinely wanted to make rather than assignments based on tradition or assumption. David had surprised everyone by volunteering to prepare his grandmother's cornbread stuffing recipe, something he hadn't made in 20 years but remembered fondly from his childhood. Tonight's Christmas Eve celebration represented another step in this evolving dance of mutual respect and consideration. When Jessica had called to invite us, she had asked about my schedule first before suggesting a time, a small courtesy that meant more to me than she probably realized. The conversation had been warm and genuine, with none of the careful manipulation that had characterized our interactions just a few months earlier. Inside, the house buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family celebration. Rachel was helping Sophie and Lucas arrange cookies on a plate while Tom discussed sports statistics with David in the easy way of men who had found their conversational groove over decades of holiday gathering. Margaret and Paul had driven down from Denver again, but this time their presence felt natural rather than pointed, guests rather than replacements. Jessica embraced me with genuine warmth, taking the wine and admiring the pottery bowl with what seemed like sincere appreciation. "This is gorgeous. I can't believe you made this yourself." "It's not perfect," I said, pointing out a slight irregularity in the rim, "but it holds what it's supposed to hold and I love the way the glaze turned out." "Perfect is overrated," Jessica replied, setting the bowl in a place of honor on their dining room table. "Handmade things have character." Michael appeared beside us, looking healthier and more relaxed than I had seen him in months. The stress lines around his eyes had softened, and when he hugged me, it felt less obligatory than it had in recent years. "Mom, I'm glad you're here. How was the pottery exhibition last weekend?" I forgot to ask. The fact that he remembered I had an exhibition at all represented a significant shift in his attention to my activity. More importantly, his question felt genuine rather than perfunctory, as if he actually wanted to hear about my artistic achievements rather than simply checking a box of filial responsibility. "It went beautifully," I said, unable to suppress my smile. 3 pieces sold, and I got some wonderful feedback from visitors about my glazing techniques. Margaret Chen thinks I'm ready to apply for the advanced ceramics program next year. That's incredible, Michael said, and the pride in his voice seemed authentic. I'd love to see some photos of the pieces that sold. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversation and connection in ways I hadn't experienced at family gatherings for years. People asked about my photography and pottery with curiosity rather than polite tolerance. When Sophie wanted to hear about my Spanish lessons, her questions sparked a discussion about travel and adventure that included everyone rather than focusing solely on the children's activities and achievements. Even David seemed more present than usual, engaging with the grandchildren's stories about school and friends instead of retreating into distracted politeness. When Lucas asked him about his work, David actually explained what insurance adjusters do in terms an 8-year-old could understand, showing patience and enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in months. The most significant moment came when Rachel approached me privately in Jessica's kitchen while I was helping arrange desserts on serving platters. "Mom, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, "about the school festival thing, and really about a lot of I never realized how much we took you for granted until you started saying no to us." Her directness surprised me almost as much as her insight. "You don't need to apologize for asking for help, sweetheart. Families should help each other, but I wasn't really asking," Rachel continued. "I was assuming there's a difference, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." She paused, studying the Christmas cookies we were arranging. "Tom and I had a long conversation about it after you couldn't help with the bake sale. He pointed out that we never ask what you need or want, we just tell you what we need from you." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any apology could have. It suggested that Rachel was beginning to understand the difference between a relationship based on mutual consideration and one based on convenient availability. "I love helping when I can," I said carefully. "I just needed our family to recognize that I have my own life and priorities now, not just theirs." "I get that now," Rachel said, "and honestly, I think it's made all of us better. Sophie's been asking me about my own hobbies because she heard you talking about pottery class. It made me realize I don't really have any interests outside of work and parenting anymore." As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave, Jessica pulled me aside near their front door. "Linda, I wanted to thank you for something that might sound strange. For teaching us how to have a better relationship with you. I know it was probably frustrating when we didn't get it at first, but your boundaries actually made me respect you more, not less. I want Sophie to grow up seeing women who know their own worth." The comment took my breath away in its unexpected wisdom. Jessica had somehow understood that my assertion of independence wasn't rejection of family but modeling of healthy self-respect. That my granddaughter would grow up watching a grandmother who valued herself appropriately rather than sacrificing endlessly for others' comfort. Driving home through the quiet streets of Maplewood, David and I maintained a comfortable silence that felt different from the disconnected quiet that had characterized our car rides for months. When he finally spoke, his words surprised me. "I've been thinking about taking that early retirement package the company offered," he said. "Maybe it's time I figured out what I want to do instead of just what I'm supposed to do." The echo of my own journey in his words wasn't lost on me. "What would you want to do?" "I don't know yet. Maybe travel, learn something new, spend time outdoors." I feel like I've been sleepwalking through the last few years, just going through the motions. He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the snowy road. "Watching you discover new passions made me realize I don't have any anymore." "It's never too late to find them," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "I'd be happy to help you explore possibilities, if you want." The offer hung between us, representing something we hadn't shared in years. The prospect of mutual support and encouragement rather than parallel existence. We weren't the same people who had drifted apart over the past few years, but perhaps we could become people who chose to grow together rather than simply coexist. At home, we sat together on our living room couch with cups of hot chocolate, looking at the photographs from my Silver Creek expedition that I had finally gotten around to printing and framing. David studied each image with genuine attention, asking questions about technique and lighting that showed he was really seeing my work rather than simply glancing at it politely. "These are remarkable, Linda," he said, holding up a photograph of mining equipment silhouetted against autumn as you've got a real eye for finding beauty in unexpected places. Outside our windows, snow continued to fall in the steady, transformative way that would reshape everything by morning. But inside our house, something equally quiet and powerful was taking place. Two people who had forgotten how to see each other clearly were learning to focus again, discovering that the life they had built together might still have room for the people they were becoming. I had started this journey feeling invisible and forgotten, standing in a restaurant parking lot watching my family celebrate without me. Tonight, I was ending it feeling seen and valued, not just by my family but by myself. The woman who had spent decades defining herself through other people's needs had finally learned to matter in her own life, and in that simple but revolutionary shift, everything else had become possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.